Good evening, everyone. My name is Professor Christine Williams. I'm Pro-Vice-Chancellor for Research at the University of Reading, and it's a real pleasure to welcome you and see so many people here. But we do have an absolutely delightful venue, I think, and apparently a roof terrace for the after-lecture drinks. But of course, the topic of tonight's meeting, climate, sustainability, environmental sciences, they're areas of research in which the UK can be said to really excel. And for the University of Reading, this is one of our particular strengths. Reflecting that, the university has recently invested in 28 new appointments in this area of science across 3 academic schools, and we were absolutely delighted to be the recipient of one of the 12 Regius chairs as part of the celebrations for the Queen's Jubilee. Now, the Walker Institute is a very key part of Reading's strength, and since its inception 7 years ago, it's significantly broadened our capability and expertise in climate science and weather prediction, and it now encompasses research into the adaptation and mitigation of climate change effects, which is, of course, equally important. But as well as cutting-edge research, engagement with external agencies and audiences, knowledge exchange and application of new knowledge is a very important part of the work that the Walker Institute does. 2 months ago, I visited Malaysia to attend a research symposium on climate insecurity, which was organised by the Walker Institute. It was a great symposium, and we met many academics working in that area, but it was humbling for me because it brought home the importance of the work that we do, and others as well in the UK and elsewhere, to more accurately predict climate extremes, which aids planning and responses to disasters. Now, I know tonight's lecture, which Lord Krebs has very kindly agreed to present, is going to focus on some of the challenges for the UK. And it's therefore a great pleasure that we have here today an audience, a very diverse audience, which will have, I hope, very many questions to ask Lord Krebs about that after he presents to you. And we're delighted to have attracted such a high-profile speaker to our lecture this evening. I'm now going to introduce Professor Nigel Arnell, who's our Director of the Walker Institute.
Thank you, Christine. The Walker Institute at the University of Reading seeks to do 2 things. Firstly, it seeks to draw together and develop research into climate change and its consequences at the University of Reading, often with research partners in other organisations. And secondly, we seek to work closely with stakeholders and users of research to make sure the research that we do is relevant and has impact. And a key part of that dialogue with stakeholders and research users is our annual lecture. We invite a leading figure to talk about a particularly topical aspect of climate change to stimulate discussion and debate about the sorts of research issues that arise from this the current topical issue, and what we can do at the University of Reading and with our colleagues to help address these issues. We've had 4 annual lectures so far, all with a particular theme. Bob Watson, the chief scientist from DEFRA in 2009, kicked off by talking about the role of science in informing government policy. And then the following year, Rowan Douglas from Willis Reinsurance spoke about climate science and how it informs and is relevant for business. The following year, we had Rowan Sutton from the University of Reading and the National Centre for Atmospheric Science talking about science, the science of climate change, and how that can inform risk assessments. And the following year, we broke away from the tradition of having a Rowan, and we had Chris Whitty, the chief scientist of the Department of DFID, who was talking about climate change and development and the research and opportunities in that particular link. It's my pleasure today to welcome Lord Krebs to give our annual lecture for 2013, focusing on adaptation with a particular focus in the UK. Lord Krebs is the chair of the Adaptation Subcommittee of the Committee on Climate Change, and that's the body charged with providing independent advice to government on climate change. And Lord Krebs is currently the principal of Jesus College, Oxford, and was previously chairman of the Food Standards Agency, and prior to that, chief executive of the Natural Environment Research Council. Last week, DEFRA published the UK's first national adaptation programme, And the Adaptation Subcommittee published this year's annual report yesterday, and I'm sure you'll have seen some of the press coverage about it. So I'm very pleased to invite Lord Krebs to give his lecture on the title, Is the UK Preparing for the Risks and Opportunities from Climate Change? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nigel and Christine, for the introduction, and thank you for inviting me to give the Walker Institute annual lecture. It's really a great honour to be here and to be able to tell you about the work of the Adaptation Subcommittee of the Committee on Climate Change. We are looking at the question of how the country is preparing for the inevitable consequences and impacts of climate change. And I see from the Walker Institute's 2012 Research Highlights Review that the Institute is very active in research in climate adaptation. In particular, I noted some really interesting and outstanding work on the vulnerability and exposure of rain-fed agriculture in Africa and on the impacts of climate change on infrastructure such as water and energy, as well as agriculture in the UK. I changed the title at the last minute because this morning I was looking at a report that's on the DEFRA website. It's quite difficult to find, but if you can find it, it's an public opinion survey of 2,000 people that was carried out in March this year, asking the public whether they think it is important for this country to adapt to climate change, and if so, whether they think that climate change will bring risks and opportunities. And it turns out that the great majority of people do think it's important to prepare for climate change. And 61% of those surveyed thought that climate change will primarily bring risks, and 23% thought that it would bring opportunities. So I thought I ought to reflect both risks and opportunities in the title. I'm not going to talk about the science of climate change itself. As Nigel has said, you've had a lecture in this series on that before, and many of you are much greater experts than I am. And I take it as agreed by the overwhelming majority of experts that human activity is influencing the climate, and it will continue to do so, possibly at an increasing pace in the future. Against this backdrop, of course, the policy responses are on the one hand to try and reduce greenhouse gas emissions through, hopefully eventually through further global agreements to follow on Kyoto, and through national targets as this country has set in law. And there was a stage when I think adaptation was seen as a bit of a cop-out. It was rather, as an alternative to reducing our greenhouse gas emissions, seen as something, well, let's give up and try and cope with it. But now I think that everybody accepts that however good we are at mitigation, and we should certainly try as hard as we can nationally and globally to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions, we are already committed by the greenhouse gas emissions we've pumped into the atmosphere over the past 150 years to substantial climate change in the future. And this is a series of simulations from the Hadley Centre showing that already the greenhouse gases that we've pumped into the atmosphere will cause climate change in the future, as it has done over the past 100 years or so. But nevertheless, there is a great deal of uncertainty, and this is central to any theme of climate adaptation. Uncertainty about the pace of climate change, uncertainty about the magnitude and the nature, because climate change is not just global warming, it can be increased storminess or extreme events, changes in rainfall patterns, sea level rise, and so on. And there's uncertainty at an even higher level when you get to projections about what will happen on a regional, national, and local scale. A few years ago, the Met Office did a valiant job in producing what's called UK CP09, Climate Change Predictions for the United Kingdom, based on the best models that are now, these projections were based on modelling that's now coming up to 8 or 10 years old. And without going into a lot of detail, these were probabilistic forecasts or projections, but generally suggesting there will be higher annual temperatures, we'll be exposed to sea level rise, warmer, wetter winters, especially in the west, hotter, drier summers, especially in the east. And you may think, well, all of that's gone pear-shaped in the last few years, but one has to remember that we're talking here about decadal scale changes, and everybody accepts that there will be significant variation due to factors that we don't yet fully understand from year to year. But this uncertainty about the future has consequences for how one thinks about adaptation. First, there will be those who claim that the science is too uncertain to justify any action at all. And if you're interested in this sort of thing, and if you're not familiar with it, I highly recommend this book, Merchants of Doubt, by Naomi Oreskes, an American social scientist, who's shown how this trading on uncertainty is precisely the tactic that industry has used to lobby against action on regulating tobacco, on acid rain, on ozone, and on climate change. And basically the strategy, as she summarizes it, they say, well, there's uncertainty and the concerns are being exaggerated. In any case, there'll be a technological fix in the future, so we don't need to do anything, particularly nothing that would regulate industry. And in some ways, it sort of mutates into saying the fact there's uncertainty means that nothing really is known, or that all alternative hypotheses are equally likely, as some of the climate change deniers would have us believe. But as Oreskes points out, that's based on a misunderstanding of how science works. Doubt works because of an erroneous view of science. Science doesn't produce certainty, it produces knowledge which may be incomplete, but that doesn't invalidate the knowledge we have. But some things we know better than others. And one analogy I like to use is that we can predict with a great degree of accuracy when there will be the next high tide. You can look it up in a book of tide tables and you can be very confident that the tide tables are accurate. But you can't predict at all when the next wave will break on the seashore. And in a way that's analogous to saying we can say with great confidence that the climate will change, but we can't tell from month to month the details of how the climate and weather will develop. But admitting that we can't predict when every wave will break doesn't undermine the validity of tide tables. So that's one aspect of uncertainty. The other, in relation to climate adaptation, is to ask what kind of action should you take under uncertainty? Should you just sit and wait? Well, no, I don't think we can afford to sit and wait. One thing we need to do, of course, is to strive to fill gaps in knowledge, to reduce uncertainty. But on the other hand, there may be certain things we need to do now, and I think those really fall into two categories. We have to think about actions now that would be sensible to do under almost any future climate scenario, low regrets actions, things that might be just sensible even if there isn't a lot of climate change, like, for example, using water more carefully because this country is water stressed. And the other thing we should think about now is to avoid making long-term decisions that would lock us in to plans and a future which would be very vulnerable if the climate change models turn out to project with a reasonable degree of accuracy what will happen in the decades ahead. And linked to that, to retain flexibility, so not getting locked into bad decisions. But on top of that, adaptation to climate change, I've talked about uncertainty in the middle, has another problem, whereas with mitigation, there are clear targets. This country has a legally binding target to reduce the greenhouse gas emissions of this country to 80% below 1990 levels by the year 2050, and everybody knows how to measure it. There's no agreed metric for adaptation, there's no agreed national set of targets. And of course, the context for mitigation, for reducing greenhouse gas emissions, is that it's a global endeavour, whereas adaptation is going to be specific to particular countries, particular regions, and particular localities. So those are some of the background issues to do with uncertainty. But as Nigel mentioned in his introduction, in spite of that, the UK took a very bold step in 2008 in passing the Climate Change Act, which was passed with all party support in Parliament, and set up a unique process. It set clear targets for mitigation, which I've referred to, and a process for adaptation in the country. And importantly and uniquely, it set up an independent advisory stroke watchdog committee, the Climate Change Committee, and its subcommittee on adaptation. And the adaptation subcommittee is required by the Act to do two things. Firstly, to advise the government on its obligation to carry out a climate change risk assessment at regular intervals. And the second is it's obliged by the Act to report to Parliament on the effectiveness of the government's National Adaptation Programme, which, as Nigel said, was published the first time last Tuesday. The first climate change risk assessment was published in 2012, just over a year ago, and it was a very first attempt to assess the risks from climate change to this country, and it's not perfect. Some of you were involved in it, so I admire what you did, but there are still, we could see it as a first step. Essentially, the process, it was led by a consortium led by H.R. Wallingford, was to identify a large number of priority risks, about 700, filter those down to 100 on the basis of their magnitude, their likelihood and their urgency. And for each of those risks, basically the underpinning analysis was a correlation between a climate variable and a response of something. So it might be temperature and growth rate of plants or something like that. And those correlations were then used to look at the impact of potential future climate change, and then it was looked at on a regional basis and scaled according to magnitude. So that was the sort of basic document that the government has used to determine the nature of its National Adaptation Programme. It's based on the key risks that are in the Climate Change Risk Assessment, and indeed the Act of Parliament requires that to be the case. The Climate Change Risk Assessment, the first one, the second one will come out in 2017, did have some gaps in it. For example, it mainly focused in the bottom left-hand corner of this matrix. So it focused on impacts in the UK arising directly from climate change, as opposed to impacts that will arise on the UK from effects elsewhere. And it could well be that the biggest impacts of climate change in this country will arise from impacts on the supply chain, for example, for food or for energy. And those were not covered in the initial climate change risk assessment and remain to be considered in the future. So we have a duty now, having advised on the climate change risk assessment, to report to Parliament in 2015 on the National Adaptation Programme. And our report is aimed to address two questions. Does the National Adaptation Programme deal with the key risks? Is it a programme aimed at dealing with the key risks? And are the plans in the programme being effectively implemented? So in order to prepare ourselves for that task, what we have been doing, starting in fact 3 years ago, but with a series of reports that started last year, is developing a method of assessing the efficacy of the National Adaptation Programme, which we call an assessment toolkit. So what we're trying to figure out is, how would you measure whether the country is becoming adapted to the risks and opportunities of climate change? And there are two, in our view, there are two ways of doing that measurement. One is to have indicators of progress in particular areas, and the other is to analyse how government and other organisations, businesses, local authorities are making decisions that will influence adaptation. So we are developing this toolkit, which we are then applying systematically to the key risks identified in the climate change risk assessment. And in our report, that's the National Adaptation Programme, in a report that came out last year, we looked at the top two risks in the climate change risk assessment, which are both related to water: too much water, resulting in flooding, and too little water, resulting in water scarcity in the public water supply. And I'm not going to go through this in detail because it's last year's news in a way, but just to give you a flavour in case you missed it, you missed the opportunity to read it voraciously when it came out last July. The sorts of indicators that we developed here were things like, are we still building in flood risk areas? And are we building at a comparable rate in flood risk areas from in non-flood risk areas? The answer is that we're putting up new buildings at a faster rate in flood risk areas than in other areas. Are we investing in flood defences that will manage that inevitable increase in risk that arises both from development and from the impacts of climate change and the consequent changes in rainfall and extreme events? So are the number of properties at risk when you balance the development and the prevention of flooding, are the number of properties at risk going up or down as we move forward? So those are the sorts of measures we looked at in relation to flooding, in relation to public water supply, what comes out of the tap. We know, and the water companies have it in their projections, that there is, as a result both of population growth, economic growth, and climate change, going to be a supply-demand gap in certain parts of the country. There's going to be a water shortage, particularly in the part of the country that we happen to be in now. And the question is what preparations do we make to close this gap so we don't end up with standpipes or water rationing? And it will require both supply and demand measures. So water companies are keen to increase supply, to reduce leakage as a method of increasing supply, but it is the case that each individual in this room, on average, uses more water, about 25% more water per person per year than our colleagues and friends in Germany. So there are measures that we need to take to reduce our individual water consumption, and one of the most effective measures is metering, charging people per unit of water used. The government has rejected the idea of universal metering, but if you look at where the projected shortages will be in the future and where metering is taking place today, there's no correlation. So we should be thinking not about where water is short today, but where it's going to be scarce in the future. So turning now to the report that was published yesterday, this looks at the impact of climate change on the land. Curiously, and I accept that this is the definition, the land includes fresh water. So the lakes and the rivers are also part of the land. And we, if you look at the way in which the land surface of England, because this report applies specifically to England, we do separate reports for the devolved countries. Here's how the land surface of England is distributed. About 3/4 of it, the smudgy orange, I would use the pointer, but the dot's so small it doesn't show up. The smudgy orange on the right, as you look at it, and then the light blue, that is agriculture. So 3/4 of the English land surface is agriculture, and then the rest, the grey, just between 11 and 12 is urban, that's about 11%, and the rest of it is semi-natural, meaning things like mountain moor, coastal margins, fresh water, and woodland. So we're largely an agricultural and urban land, but we've got a small amount of semi-natural habitat. And one way of thinking about the land in relation to climate change is that the land provides us with ecosystem services. It provides us with services of growing stuff, what are called provisioning services, so crops, timber, food, non-food. It provides regulating services, for example, regulating water flow. If the landscape acts as a sponge, it stops the water running down into the valley and flooding the town below. And a lot of carbon is stored in our soils. It provides cultural services of recreation, sporting, and aesthetic. And underpinning all of that are the basic services that the land provides, such as generating new soils and the water cycle. So we've looked at adaptation to climate change through the lens of ecosystem services. But the backdrop to all of this is, on the one hand, bad news. The land in the UK or in England has been under pressure from human activity for centuries. We are sort of greedy, so we've grabbed much of the natural resources for our own purpose and at the same time squeezed out other species. So there's habitat loss, there's species loss, and we are polluting the countryside. The good news, on the other hand, is that there are many policies in place to try and manage and improve the quality of the wider countryside, including agricultural and semi-natural habitat. Some of these come through the European Union, like the Water Framework Directive and the Common Agricultural Policy Subsidy for agri-environment schemes, and some come through national legislation. So against that backdrop, we've looked at what we call provisioning services, growing stuff, and the context, I'll talk mainly about agriculture, not saying much about forestry, is that the UK produces about 60% of the food consumed in this country, down from 70% in the 1970s. But more broadly, global demand for food is going to increase, and most of the projections suggest that by 2050, the global production of food will have to have gone from the present level to either somewhere between 80 and 100% higher. This is partly because of population growth, partly because of the so-called nutritional transition. As people get wealthier, they eat meat instead of cereals, and meat is more costly in terms of environment and space and land and water to produce. And this has led people like the former Chief Scientific Advisor, Sir John Beddington, to refer to a perfect storm, the need for more food in a world which will be more energy constrained, is water constrained, soil constrained, and also dealing with the impacts of climate change. Now, in that perfect storm, England has the potential to have a comparative advantage if we can successfully adapt both to extreme events and to the long-term trends arising from climate change. And the reason for that is that most models project that the countries that are currently big agricultural producers will suffer more from climate change than we do. For example, in Europe, the Mediterranean may well become very arid and more difficult to grow stuff, whereas England and the rest of the United Kingdom may become more favourable in terms of warmer growing seasons, provided the right adaptation measures are put in place. And those measures include particularly maintaining soil quality, using water wisely, and controlling pests and diseases that may arise, as well as managing conflicting demands on the land. In terms of water, there are great uncertainties in climate models about the future rainfall. In the 2020s, it could be that summer rainfall change is between -30 and +20% compared with today. In the winter, it could be anything between -10 and +30%. But as I've said, the general overall projection from UK CP09 is that summers will be hotter and drier, particularly in the southeast. And already many parts of the southeast of England are water stressed, defined as a water exploitation index, that's the percentage of available water used, of 20% or greater. And this applies both to public and abstracted water. But farmers for irrigation are very much dependent on abstracted water. And the forward projections suggest that under the most benign scenarios of climate change, on the left-hand side, there will be a supply-demand gap in the 2020s, which is not that far away, only 10 years away, of about 45 billion litres per year. And to put that in context, the total abstraction for farmers irrigating their crops in England at the moment is 120 billion litres per year. So this is a big gap. On a more pessimistic climate change scenario, more water stressed on the right-hand side, the supply-demand gap is projected to be 115 billion litres per year, more or less the same as the total water abstracted for irrigation today. So one key measure of adaptation will be how we're preparing for this huge deficit in water used for irrigation of crops. And there are two main things one could do. One could either create more stored water, and on the left-hand side is the plausible gain from increases in on-farm reservoirs, which we think could produce an extra 45 billion litres per year. And that's shown in red on the right-hand side. And the other way to fill the gap, if it's the more pessimistic gap, would be to decrease water use. And how could water use be decreased? Either by more efficient irrigation, or by growing different kinds of crops, or perhaps by the public accepting crops, for example, potatoes that are very water intensive, that are less than perfect, because one of the problems if you don't irrigate potatoes very intensively is they end up with cracked or scabbed surfaces, and people don't like to buy them, the supermarkets don't like to stock them. So those are the kinds of changes that a well-adapted agricultural system preparing for water shortage will have to see in the next decade or so. How is that going to be achieved? Well, in our view, the way it's going to be achieved is to put the right price on water. So it's like with the public water supply, where metering is essential to drive efficiency. In metering as well as abstraction, in public water supply as well as abstraction, if the price doesn't reflect the scarcity, then it's unlikely that people's behaviour will change. And if you look currently, this refers to the price of both main supply and abstracted water. On the vertical axis is the cost of water, pounds per cubic metre, and these are different water companies, and you can see there's no clear relationship between price and scarcity. The current water exploitation index is the measure of scarcity along the horizontal axis, and Anglian, for example, which is a water-stressed area, is one of the cheapest places to buy water, whereas the southwest, which is not water-stressed, is one of the most expensive places to buy water. So we think that a driver of investment in on-farm storage and acceptance of greater water economy and the technology that underpins that will require water pricing. The other key element of adaptation will be soils, maintaining soils. And here I just focus on one area of the very peat-rich soils of East Anglia, which are the most productive agricultural soils in England. And we already know that the peat is disappearing, the surface peat layer is disappearing. If you look at, even assuming no climate change, under the most optimistic scenario, and the different shades are a pessimistic and optimistic scenario in terms of the rate of peat disappearance, with no climate change, all the peat, surface peat soil is going to go in the next 45 to 80 years. So we haven't got a long time left to grow crops in East Anglia if we keep on doing what we're doing. If you add in the effects of climate change, and the most extreme, that could be within the next 25 to 30 years. So we could end up with no basis for growing crops in the most fertile parts of the country within a few decades. My children's lifespan, many of your children's lifespan, certainly well within our grandchildren's lifespan. So again, something needs to be done to encourage farmers to be more skillful at conserving soils, for example, by adopting minimum tillage or by growing cover crops. Related to all of that is how farmers gain the knowledge that arises from R&D. So how can technology and knowledge be transferred into agricultural practice? In one survey, only 17% of farmers surveyed obtained public sector advice on agricultural technology. And if you look across Europe, one of the noticeable things is that we have spent, our R&D investment has declined over decades. Reading University was always one of the great centres for agricultural research and probably has noticed the decline in investment in this area. But as a result of that, probably, in relative terms, our agricultural productivity has increased very little. And that's shown in a very striking diagram here. The blue is what's called the total factor productivity index, which is what's left in a multi-factor analysis when you strip out things like weather and all sorts of other variables, and you're just left with the effect of largely R&D technological improvement. And if you look at the blue, in the 1970s, the UK was well up in the middle to upper part of the league table. If you look at the red, which is 2002, we're now below Greece, Italy, Germany, France, Denmark, etc. And our growth in agricultural productivity, total factor productivity, over this time period is only 34%. Partly low because we started high, but also low because we haven't increased as much as other countries. The gap between, it's partly low because the red, we are low compared with most other countries. So an important element of adaptation is to increase both investment in R&D and the translation of that to farmers. I'm not going to say anything about forestry, but instead I'm going to move on to wildlife. And as I said, semi-natural habitats comprise a relatively small proportion of the land surface. And again, the backdrop, thanks to our behaviour, is that wildlife in this country is not in good shape. The recent survey published by a group of NGOs reported that 60% of species in this country are in long-term decline and 30% are in serious long-term decline. And the semi-natural habitats that we do have tend to be fragmented, they tend to be being lost, being eroded or degraded. Because we want more out of the land and therefore we leave less for the rest of nature. And climate change is likely to exacerbate the problems that our wildlife and our natural, semi-natural habitats already have. They're semi-natural because there's no such thing as pristine nature in this country. Of course, you may say that as a result of climate change, new species will arrive and existing ones will either disappear or migrate further north, as butterfly populations are doing, or they may migrate uphill. But the evidence suggests from ecological studies that whatever the change of the makeup of individual species is, the sites that are currently in the best condition for wildlife will be more resilient and more likely to accommodate new species. So the basis for preparing for the future with wildlife is to maintain existing sites in good condition. And here there's a very good review written by Sir John Lawton called Making Space for Nature, which was published a couple of years ago, in which he, without looking at the effects of climate change, said the three things that we have to do to manage our land for wildlife is to make the semi-natural habitats bigger, make them better in terms of quality and the quality of the habitat, and join them up so that species can migrate from one patch of habitat to another. And essentially the climate change impacts will be to underline with even greater urgency the recommendations of John Lawton's review. If you look at the 13% of the land surface that is semi-natural habitat, a small part of it is in large blocks, that's on the left-hand side, places like Dartmoor, but most of it is in patches, which may be quite small patches or could be larger patches. But essentially, most of our habitat is fragmented. And about half of this is under regulation as SSSIs, Sites of Special Scientific Interest. So looking at Lawton's trilogy, are the semi-natural habitats getting better? Are we making them in better condition? Well, the answer is no. There are plans in place. If you look at the top, this is the proportion of all SSSIs in England that are deemed by Natural England to be in favourable condition, and that's gone steadily down in the last decade. So the sites we have got, we're not looking after. You might say, well, at the bottom of the graph, this pie chart, the yellow, which goes from 540, a relatively small segment, up to most of the chart in the right-hand side, that's 2003 to 2013, the yellow represents where there are plans for improving the quality of SSSIs. So there are lots of plans in place, even though the action has not resulted in habitat improvement. And most of those plans come under agri-environment schemes. So the crucial question for the quality of semi-natural habitats is whether agri-environment schemes will be effectively implemented and whether they will continue and whether they will include habitat improvement as well as habitat maintenance. What about the question of whether natural habitats, semi-natural habitats are getting bigger? Well, over the decade 1998 to 2007, there was a 3% increase in semi-natural habitat, mainly broadleafed woodland and dwarf shrub heath. What about whether they're getting more joined up? Well, here there's no clear trend. Hedgerows are still disappearing, reducing the joining up of, say, woodland habitat. The number of ponds on farms that could be stepping stones from one large body of water to another has increased, although 80% of them are designated as being in poor condition. Turning now to peat, and I want to finish fairly soon, so I'm going to skip through this. Peat is hugely important in England for two reasons. Two regulating services as well as its recreational and wildlife significance. The regulating services are carbon storage. We have a huge amount of carbon locked up in peat, worth billions of pounds at the DEC carbon price. And peatland serves a very important environmental regulating service in purifying water and retaining water, preventing it flowing downhill. In order for new peat to form, to sustain peat, sphagnum moss, which generates the peat, has to be wet. And as the climate warms, drier conditions will make this more challenging. So at the moment, under the baseline, the areas shown in green are suitable for restoration, recreation of sphagnum moss peat. But if you look on the right-hand side, the high climate scenario just under 40 years from now, a very, very small area will be suitable for sphagnum moss recovery, for growing sphagnum moss. So peat is drying out. And if peat is going to adapt to changing climate, what it has to do is to be in good condition, that is to say wet, so that new sphagnum species can invade, because the paleoclimate record shows that as the climate changes, provided the land is wet, different, more heat-tolerant sphagnum species will move in. Now, the bad news about peat is only 4% of upland peat in England is in good condition. 96% of it is damaged by overgrazing, by draining, by burning, and by atmospheric pollution. And nearly half of that is so modified that no new peat is being formed, and 30% of it is being turned into heathland as a result of repeat burning. So out of the 3,500 square kilometres of peat, only 160 square kilometres, the light green at the top there, is in good condition. The good news, in some senses, is that another significant chunk, amounting to about a third of the peatland in England, has a restoration plan. And some of those plans are extremely impressive, although they may take many decades to fully implement. For example, in Dartmoor, South West Water is undertaking, together with NGOs, a major £45 million project to restore peatland by blocking drainage gullies and revegetating bare peat, so reinstalling vegetation, sphagnum vegetation on bare peat. The Rural Development Programme is paying farmers 27 million to reduce grazing by sheep on peatland or on upland. Grazing is very damaging to the sphagnum base. But still, 2/3 of our peatland has no restoration plan. So without action, that peatland will degrade and disappear, release its carbon into the atmosphere, and stop soaking up water and purifying water. If you look at the economics of this, it actually makes very good economic sense to restore peatland. And here's a way of looking at it. The pink, sort of dirty pink strip at the bottom is an estimate of the capital cost per hectare of restoring peatland, and it varies according to conditions, somewhere between £150 per hectare and £7,000 per hectare. Even if you assume no climate change and you look at the benefits and the costs, the benefits are largely in storing carbon, taking the DEC carbon price, which is £58 per tonne about now, and will be £284 per tonne of carbon dioxide in 2100. If you take the DEC carbon price as a benefit, and the costs are the capital costs and the opportunity costs, because if you own the peatland and you're using it at the moment for grouse shooting or grazing sheep, you're going to lose some income. But factoring those in, even today, with no additional climate change, there will be many peat areas which it would be economically sensible to restore. And if you move to a high climate change scenario, then virtually all peatland will be worth restoring. Of course, one of the issues here, and this applies to the coasts as well that I'll refer to in a moment, is that the benefits of restoring peatland are community benefits, and the disbenefits are to the individual landowner. So we have to think about how compensation works, where the benefits are at a community level and the price is paid by individual landowners. Finally, talking about coasts, I don't know how many of you live in a coastal floodplain, but 2.3 million people in this country do, in 1 million properties, of which 100,000 are at significant risk of coastal flooding. Now, in many parts of the country, the coastline is protected by artificial defences, by dikes or sea walls. And about half of those artificial defences are in turn protected by intertidal salt marsh, mudflat, sandbanks, sand dunes on the seaward side. And it's those intertidal and coastal habitats that I want to talk about in the next few minutes. They're important for, it goes without saying, for recreation, for biodiversity, and potentially for farming, as well as for coastal defence. Climate change will result in sea level rise and probably in increased storminess. And that will mean that we'll have to both invest more in sea defences and we will lose these thin strips of habitat that are on the seaward side of the hard defences. Here's an estimate from the Environment Agency and DEFRA of how much more will have to be spent maintaining coastal defences. The blue is what we're spending at the moment. Then in Epoch 1, 2010 to 2060, the estimate is that we'll go up from 125 million today up to 200 million in the next period, and then it'll go up even further in the period after that. So maintaining sea defences is going to be expensive. But we can reduce the costs and actually turn out with a net benefit if, instead of losing this marginal habitat between the hard defences and the sea, we retreat the shoreline and allow the marginal habitat to move in as sea level rises. At the moment, we're already losing coastal habitats through, for example, coastal development, through drainage, and through excavation of sand and gravel. So coastal habitats, these habitats between the hard defences and the sea, are already disappearing. But if we don't do anything about retreating the hard defences, then about 3/4 of the coastal habitats will be at risk of being squeezed out by the sea as it moves in against the hard defences. Now, this is not new. This is recognised by the Environment Agency and by local authorities, and there is a plan to retreat the coastal defences, the hard defences, over 10% of the shoreline by 2030. The only problem with the plan is that the rate of implementation is too slow. So here we are, the historical pattern, and where we are at the moment, the plan is going up at a certain rate, and if you follow that rate forward, we won't reach the target of realigning all the coastline that we need to realign to adapt to climate change. So what we need to do is increase the rate of realignment from this blue line up to the green line if we're going to adapt the coast to protect against incursion of the sea. So, just to summarise, we are saying that climate change will bring opportunities as well as risks to farmers. The key risks are water scarcity and soil degradation. I haven't talked about it, but the Forestry Commission has increased the diversity of trees planted, which is likely to be a good story for adaptation. Many wildlife habitats are not in good enough condition. The majority of upland peat is degraded and unlikely to be resilient to drier conditions, and we need to manage the coastline more rapidly to protect against future flood risk. And in terms of policies, it's about pricing water to reflect scarcity. It's about giving farmers advice on water and soil and other technological advances. It's about ensuring that existing regulations to improve condition of wildlife habitats are implemented, and introducing a stronger enforcement of current regulations, and developing a market for carbon savings and water benefits to encourage restoration of upland peat. And we've got to figure out how to deal with the difficult task of coastal realignment. So, to conclude, in many cases the policies for adaptation do exist. They just need to be fully implemented, and there are benefits to be had. So adaptation can be seen as investing for the future. And part of the way of ensuring that investment takes place is to put a value on ecosystem services such as carbon storage and water purification. Most of the concerns that we raise are recognised in the National Adaptation Programme, so the question is, which we will examine in 2015, has the recognition translated into action? And just finally, I want to pay homage to Rachel Carson. It's just over 50 years since Rachel Carson published Silent Spring, and this was one of the books that influenced me as an undergraduate to become an ecologist. And it was the book that turned conservation, which was not a politically charged subject, it was mainly the hobby of the upper classes, taking a benign interest in nature and wildlife. It changed conservation into environmentalism, because Silent Spring took on big industry and therefore turned concern for the environment into a political matter, and it attracted the firepower of industry. And to some degree we see the same today with climate change. The forces of the industries that pump greenhouse gases into the atmosphere, combined with a libertarian political view, conspire to deny the importance of tackling climate change. Rachel Carson was accused by the agriculture and chemical industries of being subversive, anti-business, a communist sympathiser, a health nut, a pacifist, and most of all, a spinster. And the language of climate change deniers today may be subtler, but the sentiment is not different. And I want to end with a quote from what is arguably the greatest novel in the English language, Middlemarch, in which George Eliot wrote, "Science is properly more scrupulous than dogma. Dogma gives charter to mistake, but the very breath of science is a contest with mistake and must keep the conscience alive." Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for an excellent and really stimulating overview of a wide area where I think UK leads the world, I think, in terms of adaptation plans and the framework for trying to deliver them. So we've got some time for some questions, if that's okay.
Yep.
So I'd like to invite questions. And when you give one, please can you say who you are and where you're from, please? Thanks. And roving mics right at the back. One here.
Dougal Goodman is going to ask the first question.
Thank you, John. I thought you might be expecting me to ask the first question. At the very end, you mentioned carbon pricing.
Yes.
And it seems to me there's been a gap between what the science community has been saying in terms of carbon pricing driving change and the political process in identifying a real carbon price. The European Union seems unable to set a realistic carbon price. Can you see a way forward?
Well, first of all, I agree with you that the European ETS, the trading scheme, is based on a carbon price that is too low. DEC has accepted the numbers that I identified there, £58 per tonne of CO2 in 2014, rising to 2100. How that translates directly into policy, which I think is your question, and the implementation of policy, is really something that we have to keep on pressing on. And we have to press that the carbon price is real, European carbon price should be higher, and the national carbon price should be reflected in all aspects of policy, not just industrial emissions, but it should reflect, as I say, in how we treat the land and conserve soils.
Hello, Neil Walmsley from Ricardo AA. There's very interesting informative lecture, so I very much enjoyed it.
Oh, you carried out this survey for DEFRA on public opinions of adaptation to climate change.
Well, I didn't want to say.
Not you personally, but I guess your company
did. Actually.
Oh, you did? Okay. Right.
My first project of the company.
Right. Sorry to put you on the spot. It was great, actually. I liked it.
I'm currently looking at the challenge of unlocking private sector investment into adaptation in a number of different areas. A lot of the work's overseas, but I'm very interested in trying to get businesses to invest more in many of these different areas that you've talked about tonight. I was just wondering if you could say a little bit more about what your focus in this area might be ahead.
Yes, it's not really my job. Our job is to report to Parliament on the progress of the National Adaptation Programme, but certainly in the conversations that I've had with with businesses across a wide range of sectors, led by the insurance industry. And one of the leaders from the British Association of Insurers said to me, our life depends, our commercial life depends on understanding climate change, and we think adaptation to climate change as well as mitigation is absolutely central. So I think there will be engagement by business, and whether it's growers who are right at the cutting edge of it, or people like Mr. Knockcut who are selling plants through garden centres. You were saying you're right at the front edge of this. So I think we need to engage business. I think what business will need from the scientists is clarity about what actually the future climate is going to be like, and what they will need from the policy people is clarity about what kinds of adaptation measures are appropriate to take. I think what is open for discussion, and I don't yet have a view on it, is how much adaptation will occur autonomously, because people recognise it is for their own good. And this applies to individual householders, let's say, when it comes to fitting flood guards, like flaps that come down over the air bricks and so on, and applies to business. How much will occur autonomously and how much has to be driven by regulation? And I think that is an open question, which I don't think we know the answer to yet. Since I've mentioned you, I'm sorry to spring that on you, but you did say to me beforehand.
As a horticulturist supplying through to the public, you said that the public must accept crops that are less than perfect. We well know the biggest problem we have as growers supplying the public is the retailer in between. Yes. I see no one here today from any of the 5 large superstores. How do you think they are going to be persuaded to market crops that are less than perfect?
Is there anybody from... Yep, there is somebody from retailer, so please could you answer the question?
Hi, my name is Simon Hinks from Sainsbury's. To answer your question is, we did a lot of work last year on changing our specifications on a lot of the root crops, so the likes of potatoes, carrots, parsnips, that kind of thing. And while customers will tell you they will happily accept those products and we happily will sell them, they won't actually pick them up. So, and we found this out to our detriment. I mean, we talked a lot last year about, and many will have heard that we talked about ugly fruit and veg as being a thing that we were very keen to support, and we did support a lot of that. And initially, for the first couple of months, it was very successful. And we talked about things like growth cracking in potatoes. And we introduced that into our basics range. The challenge for customers is that when you take a growth crack in a potato, if you then try and use that in a normal way, so you try and peel it, or you try and boil it, it actually has quite a detrimental impact on the product, because you end up with lots of different shapes and sizes. And for the customer, that's therefore quite hard to manage. So I think it's fair to say that, yes, the retailers have to engage in making the customer understand. But I think it's vital to understand what the customer actually wants. And as retailers, we listen to our customers, and we'll respond to what they're willing to buy from our shelves. So this might be a process that takes us 15 years to re-educate our customers, because we spent the last 15 years educating them. So for us, it's a big challenge, and I think it's one we're willing to take, as we proved last year. But I think it's something that, from the consumer perspective, please do understand that we do try and do things, and maybe sometimes customers don't necessarily want exactly what we think they do.
Can I come back and say, isn't it a matter of the price differential between the perfect and the non-perfect?
Good question. I think it's probably fair to say that if you look at any of and I'll speak on behalf of all the retailers here, we all operate multiple levels of tiering within our supermarkets, where we do price tier for the customer, and it's probably fair to say, certainly in terms of sort of fruit and veg, that tends to be about physical appearance. So as a general rule, we all introduce the likes of our basics ranges, that kind of thing, smart price, to try and encourage our customers to explore different types of fruit and veg, but also equally, and this has always been our priority, make sure we're chucking nothing away that is perfectly usable. And that's been the challenge for us. I mean, I personally spend a lot of time with our growers trying to work out where we put their whole crop. And that's for us and our responsibility in our entire supply chain, because potatoes, for example, is not just about the potato in a bag in produce, it's about where it's used in ready meals and where it's used in soups, and trying to get all that built together is a critical part of making sure we do a good job as a retailer.
Chris Rapley is going to ask a question.
Thanks very much. Thank you, John, for a very interesting talk. You mentioned that the next step of looking at impacts on the UK is to look at the impacts that climate change in the rest of the world will have on supply chains. I found your talk very alarming, not alarmist, and a little depressing, because it's clear that this issue, or it's clear to many of us that this issue doesn't register at what we would regard as the right level in the public consciousness or even the policy consciousness. Do you think that that next step may sharpen up that awareness? Because those companies that I'm aware of that have been looking at where they are climate vulnerable already and how they will become more climate vulnerable in the future, move from what was initially an adaptation exercise to a mitigation exercise because they don't like what they see. Do you think that that may be the same more generally for UK PLC?
Well, Chris, I mean, I could answer it in a number of different ways. In terms of public perception, the report that AEA Ricardo produced, that our colleague near the front here conducted, showed that actually a large proportion of the public recognized that action to adapt to climate change is important. I think that's right. There's a very strong positive, and the top areas that came out were in relation to flooding, water shortage, the urban environment and farming. I think those are the top areas. One thing that people can only look ahead 20 years. I think people are interested in things that will adapt and reduce risk over a 20-year time horizon, not over much longer. So I think there is some public support for it that can be harnessed. But the other question is whether there is support at the level of political leadership and perhaps business leadership, where we've talked about the business side already. In terms of political leadership, I think that has varied according to individuals who happen to be in the driving seat. And of course, whatever the particular view of a Secretary of State may be, we do have binding legislation. So I think for this country, the interesting question is, if the government itself doesn't follow the law that it has created, both to mitigate and to adapt, who is held responsible? Which is a very interesting question, and I don't have a good answer to I suppose the answer is, well, we didn't quite get there, we'll do it in the next 5 years and it's somebody else's problem. So I think you ask a good question about how it's actually going to, who's going to drive it forward. And I think there's a bit of a gap there.
Peter, halfway along.
Too many experts here, Peter.
No, Peter List, University of East Anglia. I don't know if I'm an expert or not, but I'm interested in your developing your ideas on water, saving water, making water use more efficient. I mean, you seem to have great faith in the price mechanism. I just wonder what evidence there is on how sensitive people's use of water is to the price of it. I don't think it's very strong. And the experience with water metering, which of course is another way of maybe dealing with this more fairly, but actually water metering compared with non-water metering, the saving in water is about 12% or something. It's worth having, no doubt, but it's not huge. So I mean, do we have any? Maybe we have to have water metering plus tariffs which penalise people who use a lot of water, so you have a differential tariff basically. That may be another way of making the water metering more effective. But what are your thoughts on that? Because I'm not sure price is strong enough, if you like, to do what we clearly need to do, particularly here in the southeast.
Certainly, that's a good question, Peter. I think certainly there is price elasticity. So if you look at the time trends for domestic water use from the public water supply, our water use has been going down. Things like household appliances are more water efficient, but it's gone down more steeply in the metered areas than in the non-metered areas. So there is price elasticity. Whether I don't know of any research, and others probably better informed than I am, whether there's actually any construction of a demand curve which would show what price you would have to introduce to get a very significant effect. So it may be that the present pricing regime results in a 10 or 15% reduction, but if you jacked up the price, you may get a 20 or 30% reduction. So I think, but on the other hand, I would agree with you that putting a price is important. It's not an absolute panacea, and we have to think also about behaviour change. We've already talked about accepting less than perfect produce, which is a behaviour, as the man from Sainsbury's has said, it's about us, the consumer, as well as about the retailer. So I think pricing will be part of the mix, but I think without pricing, not enough will happen. So I see it as necessary but not sufficient.
I think we've got time for one more question. Here.
Andrew Richards from National Grid. Although my question's not related to energy as it happens. Over the past 30 or 40 years, we've become very much more efficient at producing more for less, usually through just-in-time type innovations. If you have that, you become much more susceptible to shocks. And it seems to me that one of the big risks is, as we move forward, we're not going to know what the shocks are going to be like, but we probably think that they're going to be worse than we've seen before. Do you think we're going to have to backtrack on a lot of that productivity improvement, go back to sort of more traditional ways of behaving, and if so, has anybody put an economic price on it?
Again, really good question, and I haven't thought about it before. I suppose the way I've thought about it in terms of supply chains, and I should have said that next year's report from the Adaptation Subcommittee will look at adaptation in the supply chain as well as in infrastructure, which I think is the other part of your question. And I've really only thought about that in terms of the headline word resilience. Now, whether you can have a resilient system that is also just in time, or whether resilience means going back to horse and cart, I don't know yet, because we haven't done the analysis. And I would have hoped that there are ways of making a system resilient to shocks without turning the clock back. But I can't give you an answer at this stage, I'm afraid. But it's a really important question. And it applies, as you suggested, both to infrastructure like electricity, IT, telecommunications, as well as to the supply chain matters that Chris rapidly referred to. If we're subject to shocks in terms of the arrival of just-in-time things, whether it's food or components for manufacturing, then we need to have a resilient system.
Okay, right, I think we're going to draw to a close there, but that's been a really interesting discussion, and there's opportunity to carry on afterwards. I think what today's lecture has illustrated is that actually there's a lot of opportunity for really exciting adaptation to go on. The scope is there, but there's some real need for some research. Research into some basic processes, soil degradation, we saw that. Research into how adaptation decisions are made and individuals choosing knobbly potatoes. How to incorporate risk into supply chains. But there's also a big demand for making that knowledge accessible and available to the community. And the examples we've heard today are the agricultural community. And that actually is perfectly pitched actually for a University of Reading audience and presentation. So thank you for attending, and thanks again to our speaker.